this country is at war with Germany.
We shall go on to the end.
I remember the sheets of flame which came up and almost blinded us from our guns.
In this episode, I'm joined by best-selling author Damien Lewis to talk about Archie Gibson, one of the remarkable men featured in his new book, SAS Great Escapes Four. Archie served with the Long Range Desert Group and worked closely with the SAS during some of the earliest and most daring operations. His wartime journey took him from the harsh deserts of North Africa to the rugged terrain of Yugoslavia, where he operated alongside local resistance fighters behind enemy lines. Damien, thanks for joining me. So, Lewis Archie Gibson, and he'll be Long Range Desert Group, SAS. Is he in the SAS in Yugoslavia, or is he still Long Range Desert Group?
Bizarrely, it seems to be kind of LRDG, but what the Long Range Desert Group in Yugoslavia doesn't really add up, does it? So I think it all gets blurred by that stage.
Yeah, that's what I sort of thought, because these sort of funny, I don't mean private armies, but these sort of private armies sort of start to get pushed together once the Middle East is gone.
And it's very fluid in terms of, you come across guys who are serving in SAS, SOE all at the same time, former LRDG, then become SBS, and it's very, very fluid. And I think they just used whoever they needed at the time for the job in hand.
Yeah, and I guess I don't mean freelancers, but, they're not necessarily regularly attached to a unit, so presumably these...
Yeah, that's right.
Private armies are easy to move.
They're still in their parent unit. Formally, they are still serving with whoever their parent unit is, so they're just... they're special list on secondment, really. So obviously that secondment is very fluid. That's why you find the same characters popping up in all these different special forces units all through the war.
Well, let's start with Gibson's background. Who was he? How does he find his way into the army? Because that's often an interesting point. Does he have a long military history?
No. Gibson was not a regular army individual at all, really, before the war. And he grew up in Scotland, and he was the son of a Scottish businessman. He had a kind of maverick, adventurous childhood in the sense that his parents were in finance. He was supposed to follow in the family footsteps, and that was never going to happen. So, riding motorbikes in his teens with no license, and generally going off and doing all the crazy kind of stuff that we all did when we were that kind of age. And the war in the army really was when Gibson found his mojo, I guess. It was, he found something that was not the financial banking background of his family that he could go into, which was going to, light his candle, which was going to satisfy his thirst for adventure. One of the fascinating things about Gibson is that, or Gibson's story, is that the only reason it's tellable in the book is that his son sent me the manuscript that he wrote. In fact, he wrote two versions after the war. He wrote it twice. So he sat down to write, his wartime story, typing it up by hand. And I think a lot of people did this, to be frank with you, to slay the demons. So many of them did that, writing as a kind of therapy. And Gibson obviously sat down to write it twice and never did anything with it. And then his son reached out to me a few years back and said, would you like to read this manuscript, this unpublished memoir, which, of course, I was extremely excited to read it. And then this mind-blowing story dropped out of it, which is the one we're talking about now.
I did have a question about that. He titles it Habdalula. What is that? An in-joke that I've missed? It's a specific title. I thought, what's the joke that I've not got there?
No, it's an Arabic expression, and of course, bear in mind these guys cut their eye teeth in North Africa, so Arabic was the lingua franca of the locals. So it's hardly surprising, really. Kind of that Arabic culture filters into a lot of the early SAS and related units, LRDG kind of legend and esprit de corps, down to things like the SAS wings are actually inspired by the wings of a beetle from a hotel in Cairo. A lot of that kind of Arabic culture filters into the founding ethos because that's where they were. That they were embedded in that kind of culture and people.
So he is posted to North Africa, and he's there in 1941. I was going to skip to 1941 because he's captured in 1941, which is another oddity for somebody who then escapes. So what happens to him to be captured?
Gibson has a real baptism of fire in North Africa. I mean, he goes through some really bruising and difficult and, well, I mean, like so many of those soldiers in North Africa did. It was, first of all, we had a massively outnumbered British army in North Africa, takes the war to the Italians and is immensely successful. So it's all brilliant and fantastic. But of course, then Rommel turns up with the Africa Corps, and the tables are very much turned. So very many of those British soldiers on the ground at that time, having fought their way all across North Africa from the east, from Egypt really all the way through, and vanquished the Italians, suddenly they're on the back foot, and a lot of them are getting, well, they're seeing horrendous things. Their friends and colleagues getting killed and captured. Gibson's caught up in that horrendous kind of overrunning of German forces on the advance.
But he's picked up. This is often when people are picked up, they don't necessarily get away. It's not necessarily the greatest of escapes, but it is quite a unique escape that he has.
His truck gets hit, and he's driving across the desert, and he's on a delivery run. Because of his. I mentioned earlier his love of motorcycles. He bought one illegally when he was a kid and was driving it with no license and no insurance and stuff. But he's always loved motorcycles. And so the dispatch rider in North Africa, and then he was just in a truck doing a delivery run, and he's driving through the desert, and out of the blue sees this flash up ahead, and it's an 88mm German anti-armor weapon. And he realizes he's going to stay in the truck or die, or leap out of the truck and not die. So he leaps out of the truck. Truck gets hit, obviously a fireball, narrow brush with death. The guys up ahead turn up in an armoured car. The Germans turn up in an armoured car. They load him aboard. There's hardly room for him aboard the armoured car. And obviously he's now in captivity. And then they stop somewhere for a tea break or something. And they get attacked in turn by Allied forces. So it's a counter-attack. The Germans just decide they've got no time for Gibson anymore. They kick him out. And he's left there in the desert. When the British forces turn up, who've obviously mounted this attack, they don't believe Gibson is who he says he is. He's there. He's dressed just in a pair of shorts, I think, at this stage. No boots on or anything. And they presume he's a German because they've captured him, where a German armoured car was. And it takes him a long time to convince them eventually. It's the swear words, I think, in good squaddy slang, which eventually convinced the guys who've got him that, Gibson is who he says he is. And that's his great escape. It's not the most glorious, but it is great fun. And the thing about it is, Gibson says that when he jumps out of the truck and it's on fire and stuff, there's no way he can escape, of course, because he's been driving along barefoot in just a pair of shorts, which typifies the man. So he's not even got a pair of boots to try and hightail it across the desert.
So he finds his way, actually misses out on joining the long-range desert group initially, doesn't he? But he does eventually find his way into the long-range desert group. How did they recruit?
So the NRDG, rather like the SAS did in future, they would drive around the desert, going to regular units and basically just doing a sales pitch. I mean, actually, really quite often what they would do is they'd turn up at the brig where there were the bad boys, so-called, being held, and they would say, right, what are you here for? When they heard what they were there for, they'd choose the ones they thought had the right spirit and say, jump in the Jeep, and there'll be no questions asked, and you're off to join the SAS. Not that any of them knew who the SAS or LRDG was. They just, that was often a recruitment method. With Gibson, he misses out first time around because he's off on a driving job. He's very, very peed off about it because that's what he wants to do. He wants to get into the desert and fight. There's a second recruiting opportunity and Gibson jumps at it, and that's how he's recruited into the long-range desert group. Now, who were the long-range desert group? We should say that because they're not as well known as the SAS. So the long-range desert group were formed by Bagnold, a British desert explorer before the war. And Bagnold had this idea that if you could navigate and penetrate the desert, you could go on and gather priceless intelligence from behind enemy lines. That was the concept behind the NRDG. He put his proposal to British High Command numerous times early in the war and was constantly rebuffed until he got it into the hands of one of the generals who basically saw the opportunity. And it's the same concept with special forces, really, across the board. High risk, high reward. So these missions are high risk because the chance of getting lost, dying of thirst, starvation, capture, death are very high. But the reward, the potential reward, is very high as well. And the other thing about them as well, which categorizes them, is that you actually don't risk a great deal of men or war material. So your actual risk in terms of, vehicles and weaponry and men is very low for what your potential rewards will be. That's kind of the concept behind them. They're called force multipliers. That's the modern day phrase. So Bagnall finally gets the green light and he forms Long Range Desert Group. And what they start to specialize in is driving these two-wheel drive Chevrolet trucks, so like a pickup truck, across the desert. And obviously, as I said, Bagnall was a long experienced desert navigator. And so they perfect the technique of penetrating deep into the Sahara Desert, getting thousands of kilometers sometimes behind enemy lines to largely carry out intelligence gathering operations, so to spy on the enemy, reinforcements and troop movements. They do carry out some kind of on-the-spec raiding operations, but really when they have to, it's like a corollary of their main mission. So like if they're bumped by the enemy, then of course they fight. But otherwise, they're very much a covert force. And what they become most famous for, well, famous, that's not true because they weren't famous for it during the war because they were covert. But one of the things they're most well known for now is what was called Road Watch. And specifically, if I can try and explain it, Rommel, so General Rommel, the German commander, was sending signals to Hitler claiming that he was desperate for war material and reinforcements, right? And because we had the Bletchley decodes, we obviously could read these signals, but we knew that his actual number of tanks and planes and all the rest of it was far higher than he was saying. So the people at Bletchley started to worry that the Enigma secret had been penetrated and Rommel was deliberately trying to send them false intelligence. So they needed a way to verify what was the case. And so they got the LRDG to camp out on the Jebel, on the high ground, overlooking the main coastal highway, and literally count all of his reinforcements going along that road towards the front line. And by doing that, they managed to prove that Rommel was actually deliberately underreporting what he had to Hitler as a means to try and get more material. So in other words, Rommel was lying to Hitler and trying to trick Hitler, not lying to us to try to penetrate Enigma. Does that make sense? So the LRDG Road Watch proved that Enigma was actually working and was returning perfectly, absolutely accurate intercepts, but Rommel was lying to Hitler. That's one of their greatest coups.
And they're also, now well known as the it's flippantly, I was going to call them the taxi service for the SAS, but that's very flippant. But that things like Rogue Heroes has really sort of put them in that sort of spotlight. And Gibson does become the driver for David Sterling. Now, what I did find curious, the two had met before the war, hadn't they?
Yeah. Gibson's a remarkable character. I mean, he really is. And he met Sterling before the war during an exercise, in the UK. And basically he'd been driving Sterling somewhere and he just thought, this guy's a useless dilettante. He just absolutely thought, what a waste of space. That was his initial impression of David Sterling. Of course, he was this highborn guards officer, the Sterling family related to the royal family, very, very much from that background, which Gibson was not. Gibson was from I would imagine, a middle-class, banking family from Scotland. So he had a really low opinion of David Sterling. Of course, what happens in the desert is when the first SAS Operation Squatter is so disastrous and, 62 parachute in and only 20 odd come back and the rest are all killed or upon landing or captured because there's this terrible, terrible desert storm blows up. So they're obviously, parachuting into hell. When it's such a disaster, the Long Range Desert Group step forward and say, we can drive you to target and we can pick you up again. There's no need to parachute and take those risks. And so that's how they become known as the SAS nicknamed the Long Range Desert Group, the SAS taxi service, and the Long Range Desert Group nicknamed the SAS the Parashites because they never parachute anymore. And so during that process, David Sterling sees that Gibson has named his own vehicle, his Chevrolet, Wildar. All of the LRDG trucks had their own names, whoever was in command could name them. And because the SS motto by then is who dares wins, when Sterling sees this truck with who dare on it, he thinks, well, that's the truck, that's the driver for me. So Gibson very quickly becomes Sterling's driver. I don't know if Sterling remembered meeting Gibson, but Gibson certainly remembered meeting Sterling. And suddenly, here he was face to face with a very different kind of individual indeed. And his respect for and admiration for David Sterling very quickly knew no bounds.
It's funny. I always like these pre-war moments where people's careers crossed in the army. They're always quite interesting. They could be formative of people's opinions and formative of people's friendship groups, which put them up or down various lists of who's doing what, which it's fascinating. Gibson is Sterling's driver when they do the raid on the port of Burat. Have I got this wrong, or am I misremembering? Is that in Rogue Heroes, that raid? They do a raid in Rogue Heroes in that first series.
I don't think this one's in Rogue Heroes, not this one.
Right. I didn't think it was, but then I suddenly thought, I'm sure there's one where they creep about a port. And
there is one where they creep about a port, but it isn't this raid.
Somehow it didn't feel right. But anyway, when I was reading it, I suddenly had recent pictures in my head of what it might look like, which was kind of illustrative. This port raid, how key was the port? So the LRDG are taking in the SAS to raid the port. How key is this port to the Axis forces in North Africa?
Yeah, well, Burat is one of the key ports which Rommel's using to resupply his forces. So that's the reason they go and attack it. The idea behind it is this. It's part of the SAS ethos, which is, think the unthinkable and then do the unthinkable. Because if you can think the unthinkable and do the unthinkable, clearly the enemy would never have thought that's the way you might attack them. So you're going to maximise surprise. It's it's Ron Seal. It does what it says on the tin. It's a great way of strategizing things. So they've attacked and hit again and again these desert air bases of Rommel. Some of them they hit so many times that they became, like Tamet Air Base became known as Paddy's own, as in Paddy Mayne, because he raided it so many times. And because they've hit these air bases so many times, obviously Rommel's reacted and he's increased his guard force. There are men camping on the aircraft 24/7. There are guard dogs. There are mobile armoured car patrols. It's getting a bit more difficult. And so Sterling has the idea, well, let's do a port, because the ports are, the vital conduits via which Rommel's supplies arrive. And if we can get into the harbour and sink a couple of ships in the port's entranceway, that will scupper their ability to resupply themselves. And the battle in North Africa was crucially all about supply lines. That's all really it was about. Who could maintain their supply lines was going to win. And so they set off across the desert to raid Burat port. And when they get there, they realise that, well, two things have happened. One, the fold boat, the foldable canoe in which they're going to go into the harbour and sink all the ships, has been shaken to pieces during the journey across the desert, rather predictably.
It struck me that it's not necessarily a boat I want to go into if it falls to pieces that easily.
No, that's right. Yeah. But nonetheless, not daunted, they decide to go ahead anyway. And there are very few vessels in port, actually, by sheer bad luck. And so instead what they do is they go into the port at night and they go around all the warehouses stuffed full of supplies and they plant their Lewis bombs, these incendiary bombs, in the main warehouses, which is a good target. And then they're withdrawing and then they hit the jackpot because they reach this car park, this big vehicle park, and they find it's full of enemy fuel tankers waiting to drive out in convoy. And so they go around this park planting their Lewis bombs. The last thing they do is they see an anti-aircraft gun and they put the last Lewis bomb, they plant it in the barrel of the anti-aircraft gun, even as the enemy sentries are sleeping. Then they skedaddle out of there. And as they're leaving and as the whole of Burat port is now exploding in this unbelievable cataclysm of burning warehouses, but more importantly, flaming, burning oil tankers, they get on the road in the Chevrolet, which Gibson is driving, and they decide to do some shoot-em-ups along the highway, which they do. They plant bombs on various oil tankers and all the rest of it. But eventually, of course, the enemy think we've had enough of this. And so they set their own roadblock. And it's in that process that Gibson kind of earns something of a legendary reputation, because he basically saves them all, you could argue, including David Sterling, of course, because what's happening is they're driving back along the road towards what is clearly an ambush, and the enemy have opened fire. And they've got two choices, obviously. Well, I suppose you could argue they have three, but you're not about to do a 3-point turn when you're under enemy fire, and the road's probably not wide enough anyway. So the two choices are, one, drive hell for leather through the ambush and shoot their way out of it, or two, get off the road and escape via the desert. And classically speaking, getting off the road and escaping via the desert would be standard operating procedure, because the SAS were not there to stand and fight. They were there to hit and run, sabotage operations, gather intelligence. So Sterling gives the order, get off the road. He's sat in the front. He's in the passenger seat. Gibson's driving. Gibson refuses. He ignores the order because he can see, as is often the case. I don't know if you've ever been in the desert, but I've driven across it twice, and the roads are often kind of raised up. So it's a raised platform, basically. And if you try and drive off, you're just going to roll the vehicle. Certainly at speed, you roll the vehicle. This is what Gibson realises, because he's got his foot to the floor. If he goes off, he tries to drive off the road, they're just going to roll the vehicle, and they're all going to be dead or injured. And so he ignores Sterling's order instead, and actually knowing that he's got on his shoulder 2 or 3 real stalwarts from the SAS who he knows will fight like demons when they hit the ambush up ahead. Gibson knows that. And so he puts his foot down and says, no, we're going through. And that's exactly what they do. They barrel ahead, they hit the ambush, they fight their way through it, and unbelievably, miraculously get through to the side and escape to the desert, and none of them are injured, and the vehicle's still just about drivable. And again, this is, I guess, important, because it gives real insight into David Sterling's character. Because Gibson disobeyed an order. Not that the SAS were very much constrained by rank order. I mean, their ethos was merit above rank, and this epitomises it. So Gibson disobeyed an order, got everyone out alive, and what does Sterling do? He recommends him for a High Valour medal, and which Gibson gets. So that's a real kind of indication of how Sterling's actions in the field reinforced the ethos behind the SAS.
There's a certain self-confidence in himself to acknowledge that he's being disobeyed, but actually the guy took the right decision at that moment, as he could see it, being the driver, being the captain of the vehicle, as it were.
You got it in one. That's absolutely the case. Yeah.
You've got to trust people. Well, now what I find intriguing, and as I said before we started, he's sent to Yugoslavia next, which I trawling through my memory, my only reference to Yugoslavia was Force 10 from Navarone, which has got Harrison Ford. It's a real funny mix of characters. I can't even remember very little about it other than sort of Czechniks or whatever they are walking around in sheepskin jackets. We should probably outline, do we need to outline what's happening in Yugoslavia? It's almost too complicated. What have they been sent to Yugoslavia to do?
Obviously, North Africa is one. The LRDG then kind of team up with the SBS, the Special Boat Service. There's a load of Greek island and Aegean island raids. Gibson's on a load of those. And then at the end of that, it's like, well, what do we do with them next? And as we said at the beginning, these kind of identities are very fluid at this time. Are you in the SAS? Are you in the SBS? Are you in the LRDG? Are you in Polski's private army? A lot of these guys were in several of these units at the same time. And of course, they're all still formally serving in their parent units. So anyway, Gibson and his long-standing patrol of men are dispatched to Yugoslavia, as were a lot of LRDG patrols, actually. And this is their mission. At the start of the war, Yugoslavia fought against forces of Nazi Germany. Very quickly, forces of Nazi Germany and Italy, of course, overran them. And so those who wished to resist went to the hills, and they formed bands of partisans, the Czechniks that we all know about, and the more communist-leaning partisans. So they're two kind of partisan bands. And there were also, of course, the die-hard, pro-fascist bunch, the Ustaše, who were fighting against them too. So, really bitter and bloody internecine guerrilla warfare going on in the Yugoslav hills. And it's to aid the partisans that Gibson's patrol is inserted into Yugoslavia. And specifically what they're going there to do is to try and get a handle on the air missions flown by German warplanes from Yugoslavia over the Aegean and the Mediterranean, which are really hampering Allied shipping. That's really what they're there for. So it's a bit like Road Watch. It's watching the air instead. But also, of course, they're there to, wherever possible, destroy the enemy forces and their warplanes on the ground. So Gibson and his men are deployed to Yugoslavia by sea. They get a very, very, very lukewarm welcome. In fact, they're refused entry. They've got, they say, passeurs from, signed by Marshal Tito, the Yugoslav partisan commander. Doesn't cut any ice with the Czechniks on the ground or the partisans on the ground. They just turned around and sent back home first time around. So they have to go in a second time with even more top cover. And eventually, I think it's over a bottle of Slivovich. I'm pretty certain it's over a bottle of some really, really seriously punishing alcohol that they managed to form some kind of bond with those partisans with whom they land on Yugoslav shores, and eventually they start to trek into the hills to begin their mission.
It's slightly curious because I guess in the desert there, they are operating on their own. There is hundreds and hundreds of miles of nothing. And suddenly you're in Yugoslavia, it's mountain territory, so you're in a different sort of style of terrain. But at the same time, you're having to work with other people who might or might not like you to some greater or lesser degree. So what's that relationship like with the partisans? Is it one of suspicion? Do they... I mean, I'm assuming Gibson and his men can't speak Yugoslavian.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So for guerrilla operations, which is what, the SAS and LRDG, all these units are really involved. For guerrilla operations to be possible, you need one of two things. You either need wide open spaces where no one lives, like the North African desert, because there you can operate and you can withdraw to your base in reasonable security and Bob's your uncle. Or if you don't have that, you need the local population to be on your side. You need them to succour you, shelter you, feed you and fight alongside you if at all possible. Without those two things, guerrilla operations can't work. What do they have in Yugoslavia? Well, they have a relationship which is really one of mutual suspicion from the get-go with the partisans. It's only when they get to the partisan base and, this is after trekking through the hills with them and all the rest of it. They get to the partisan base and they are attacked by a force of, these paramilitaries allied to Nazi Germany. And the partisan leader realizes they're in danger. They're heavily outnumbered. He realizes they're in danger of being outrun. He's forbade Gibson and his men from joining in the battle. And eventually he has to turn to them and say, okay, we need your help. And then Gibson and his men, of course, fight like devils incarnate. And the Yugoslav leader thinks, okay, these guys are serious. And at that moment, there's this real bonding between them. It's a long, long stand-up firefight. It lasts many, many hours at night. And eventually, of course, Gibson and his men and the partisans overcome. And the partisan leader basically welcomes them then in with open arms.
At that point, do they start to operate with the partisans as on raids and things?
Yeah, absolutely. So pretty much from that moment, and increasingly as they form these incredible bonds with those that they're there embedded with, the forces they're embedded with, increasingly they start to be allowed to go on offensive operations. And then eventually, of course, they end up leading those offensive operations because they're by this stage, they're trekking through the mountains to get eyes on a German position or a concentration of German troops, because by now the Germans are starting to retreat from Greece and they're moving up through Yugoslavia. So there's massive flows of enemy armour and senior commanders coming through. And of course, Gibson can get eyes on those and start to call in airstrikes. And it's at that stage, again, the partisans think, they start to realise the power of the unit they have embedded in their number. So it starts to change the whole dynamic to the degree that Gibson's men are starting to lead the strategy and lead where operations should take them to.
Geographically, they're working within a sort of set area. Do the Germans become aware of their presence and actively start to try to hunt them down? Because presumably suddenly these partisans have got very good with outside support as well from the air.
Almost from the get-go, the Germans know that Gibson and his men are there. Right from the start. The war in Yugoslavia was horrendous. It was bloody and extremely violent and hellish at times. They are on the run for probably 50% of the time they're there. And they're running from village to village. And often they run to a village and it's already been destroyed and burned and everyone killed and mutilated. Or they go to a village and they're sheltered, and when they leave, the Germans turn up and everyone gets, the village gets burned down and everyone gets killed and mutilated. It's really, really horrendous stuff. And often they're in a village and then they're forced to leave the village because the enemy attacks. So for so much of that time in Yugoslavia, they are running and running and running from the enemy, but attacking and counterattacking at the same time. So it's really high stakes, high octane stuff. And you can imagine the psychological toll that takes on those guys, because, they know that if they take shelter in a village and the enemy find out, terrible things are going to happen. And they know that if they call in airstrikes on a German position and then somehow that's linked to local villagers, they're going to pay the price. And so that happens time and time and time again to them.
It is remarkable sort of series of almost fighting, I don't mean retreats, but battles as they try to move to somewhere to catch their breath, and they're never seemingly able to quite catch their breath before they have to move on again, and then slowly the radio packs in. How did they eventually get out?
Gibson basically is drawn to a young, beautiful female Yugoslav partisan who's his translator. And clearly he falls in love with her. There's this really heart-warming love affair between the two of them. She has only narrowly herself escaped from, forces of Nazi Germany and you start say. So he spends a lot of his time with her, when they're on the run and when they're going through these repeated episodes of having to fight their way out of German ambushes and traps. And eventually the radio packs up. This is absolutely key, because what Gibson's realised, and what the Yugoslav partisans have realised, is that the radio and calling in airstrikes is this massive, massive false multiplier. That's the game changer on the ground. That's what caused why the Germans are so apoplectic, because they've realised that there is this small force of British soldiers somewhere with the partisans calling hellfire and damnation from the skies upon them. So that's why the hunt is so extreme. But their radio packs up, and at that stage it's like, well, without a radio, we can't do what we're here for. And so Gibson decides that he's going to trek back across the Yugoslav mountains, get to the coast, cross the Adriatic, get back to Allied lines, grab another radio, and return. And of course, he's got many reasons to return. Not the least of which is the young, beautiful Yugoslav translator lady he's fallen in love with, and secondly, his desire to fight, his hunger to fight, which all his men shared. They had made common cause with the Yugoslav partisans by now, and their bonds ran very deep. So they set off, and again, they're hunted all the way. And to make it even more kind of mission impossible, they're burdened with dozens of Italian prisoners of war. So Italy fought in Yugoslavia. Lots of them got captured or surrendered, have been held in the hills by the partisans. Now they want to get back to Italy. And Italy surrendered, of course, or joined forces with the Allies. And so Gibson has to take a load of these Italian partisans with him, which he uses largely as his porters for all their equipment. So anyway, so they fight their way back across the Yugoslav mountains and get to the coast, and they're going to catch one of the warships going back across the Adriatic. And Gibson then has to say this really heart-rending, emotional farewell to his young, beautiful Yugoslav lady translator, and he promises that he'll be back, and she makes him vow that he's telling the truth and all the rest of it, and he does intend to be, of course. And so he boards that ship, sails to Italy, to the nearest Allied headquarters. And of course, when he gets there, he finds that part of the reason that they've been told to withdraw is not so they can get another radio and get deployed again. It's also because, the machinations that are going on at a very high level is that Marshal Tito is, of course, a communist. They have been embedded with the communist partisans. He's realised that the way geopolitics are going, Yugoslavia is going to end up being in the Russian sphere of influence, not in the Western American, British sphere of influence. And so, British special forces, much that they were very useful at the time, are no longer really welcome. So Gibson has this hellish situation which he falls into, where he keeps on and on trying to get back to Yugoslavia with a radio to meet with the partisans, but also this young lady he's fallen in love with, and he's never allowed to go.
Do we know what happened to her? Did she manage to get out?
The sad story is he goes to visit one of his men in hospital. They then deploy on further missions, not back to Yugoslavia. There are casualties and some are injured. He goes to visit one of his men in hospital. And whilst there, he hears there's a Yugoslav partisan in the hospital, goes to visit him and asks him if he happened to hear about a young Yugoslav female translator. And that man tells him, yes, she was killed recently in a battle.
So how did Gibson end the war? Does he go out with a bang somewhere?
Yeah, Gibson basically continues to deploy on operations across the Aegean for some months. But the bottom line is that he's pretty finished by now. He's not just exhausted and had every tropical disease and other ailment under the sun you can imagine, but he's carrying a hellishly heavy burden of trauma. That's the truth. The rest of the war was quite difficult for him.
What did he do after the war? Or did he stay in the army, or did he choose to leave? Did the army want him?
So after the war, Gibson spends his demobilisation, so he leaves the army, spends his demobilisation money buying a Rolls Royce, typical Gibson, goes into the family business and actually becomes a very successful businessman. In fact, he started one of the first Harley Davidson franchises in Scotland, among other things, with his love of motorbikes. But the truth of the matter is that he was always a wandering soul. So he'd go and travel the world and, take his guitar and busk his way around different parts of the world. He had this wanderlust and this, I would imagine he had some kind of PTSD that he was dealing with as well, post-traumatic stress disorder. It seems so from reading between the lines. So he had a very, very interesting life after the war, very successful in business, but I would imagine troubled at the same time.
Now, I know you had his memoirs, but what I'm intrigued by is how hard are these stories of the men in the SAS to put together? Because my assumption is, if you're writing a conventional unit history, you'll potter down to the archives, you'll pull the unit war diaries out, and there'll be a day-by-day description of what's happened. Presumably, the SAS are not keeping war diaries like that. They're small units on the run. How hard are these stories to piece together?
You'll be amazed. With Gibson's story, right, in the archive, there are the war diaries of all the units that deployed to Yugoslavia, including this one. They're not incredibly detailed, but they still have day-by-day entries as to what they're up to. I could cross-reference everything in his manuscript with the war diary entries. That's the first thing. Second thing is, amazingly, the Gibson family, so kind of them, they shared with me all of his personal archives as well. So he kept his own diaries. He wrote this amazing poetry. And he also doodled lots of kind of images and, pictures from where he was in the war, which are, really evocative. And his letters and everything else. So from all of that material, you can piece together absolutely where they were, what was happening, and really bring it alive, really bring it kind of off the page.
Yeah, it's fantastic. It's unlike trying to piece my father's together. I found his diary, which stopped literally as he went to France because he'd probably been told he couldn't write a diary. Then I asked him, 60 years later to write down what he remembered. Then I compared that with the unit diary and it was miles out. He had every date wrong and wafted all over the place in his reminiscence. And then it turned out when I actually sat down and went through it all, he wasn't really sure what was happening around him. It was very peculiar. It must be really nice when it all sort of slots together quite nicely with a proper memoir written not long after the war. So it's all...
Yeah. Priceless. I mean, that's real gold dust.
Damien, we're going to pause there. We'll be back in a moment. So anyway, I was just going to finish with, because currently there's this push, I was going to ask you about Paddy Maines VC. There's a push currently for Paddy Mayne to receive a retrospective Victoria Cross. I guess it's also posthumous because he dies in the 50s. I wonder what is that in recognition of? Was that a single action, or is that a bit more like Leonard Cheshure, who got one for basically just been remarkable for a long period of time?
Yeah, no, it's for one action in April 1945 at near Oldenburg in Western Germany, where Paddy forces, they were then called. They're acting as the spearhead for, believe it or not, in their kind of like open-topped, unarmoured jeeps, they were acting as the spearhead for the Canadian Armoured Brigade, massive Sherman tanks. So much so that when the Canadians saw them drive past and disappear off into Germany to find the way, they nicknamed our little friends and their mechanised mess tins because they looked like from the height of a Sherman. Anyway, they start driving, the spear into Nazi Germany, facing Volkssturm Home Guard and Hitler Youth and remnant parachute elite troops. No one's giving any quarter. This is the battle for Nazi Germany. And the lead elements of Paddy Mayne's Jeep patrol are ambushed, horrendous ambush. And Major Dick Bond, one of his deputies, is killed by a sniper. Somebody tries to go forward and rescue him, not knowing he's dead. He gets killed by the sniper as well. He's got 2 men dead. And the rest of them, they've debussed from their jeeps. They're in a ditch. They're pinned down with horrendous fire. Some are injured, and they're all going to get captured or die. And when Mayne hears about this, he gets in his jeep, drives forward, grabs a Bren gun, goes ahead on his own to take out the nearest German positions, and then comes back and says basically words to the effect of, "Who wants to have a go?" And Sergeant John Scott, who's another incredible, legendary figure, steps forward and volunteers to be the gunner on his Jeep. So Paddy Mayne gets in the Jeep, drives into the heart of that enemy ambush, through it, directing the fire from John Scott onto the enemy positions. They get through the far side, spin the Jeep around, drive back into the ambush, direct more fire onto the enemy positions. And as they pass the men in the ditch who are all injured or in cover, Mayne says, "We'll be back for you." He gets back to his start line, spins the Jeep around again, drives back into the heart of the ambush, puts down more fire on the enemy, and then spins the Jeep around for a second time, drives back to where his men are sheltered in the ditch. Paddy Mayne gets out, lifts all the injured into the Jeep, drives the Jeep back to his own lines, and the ambush is broken, and that's how all those men are rescued, for which any number of those in that ditch, said after the war, if Mayne hadn't come from them, they would all be dead. He was written up for a Victoria Cross by the two senior officers on the ground who witnessed it. One was Sergeant Scott, the other was Lieutenant Surrey Dane. And then the Canadian general in charge of the Canadian Armoured Unit writes him up for Victoria Cross. That's endorsed by Brigadier Mike Calvert, who's the head of the SAS at the time, and various other individuals. And then at some stage, it gets downgraded to a third bar, to his Distinguished Service Order, or fourth DSO. So the campaign at the moment is to ensure that Paddy Mayne gets the Victoria Cross for which he was rightfully put forward at the time.
Oh, what surprised me about that is the fact that how can you give someone a fourth DSO? As I say, it got me thinking of Leonard Cheshure, where everyone suddenly looked round and went, hang on, he's completed 4 tours and he's just done it so remarkably unobtrusively. We're going to give him a Victoria Cross because it's remarkable in itself. One would assume by the time you've given someone 4 DSOs, that within itself is worthy of a Victoria Cross.
Yeah, no, absolutely. If not for that action at Oldenburg, 5 years of leading operations behind enemy lines, arguably Britain's greatest ever frontline soldier, the man who saved the SAS during the war when they were about to get disbanded after David Stirling's capture, a legendary figure. Even cumulatively, a Victoria Cross would have been appropriate. But for that very action, that's an absolute case in point as to where a Victoria Cross would have been justified. So it appears to be, from recent documentation that we've managed to dig up, that it's a error. People overseeing the Victoria Cross recommendation seem to have misread the Victoria Cross rules, which say it should be a signal, SIGNAL, a signal, an incredible or exemplary act of valour. So they seem to have misread that and seen it as being a single act of valour. And so they argued that because Paddy Mayne had Sergeant Scott with him on the Jeep, he wasn't acting alone, therefore it wasn't worthy of the Victoria Cross. Well, by that judgment, everybody who got a Victoria Cross at Rorke's Drift shouldn't have got one because they were acting as part of a unit. So it seems to have been just a basic, simple error of interpretation. And in that case, correcting that error is the right thing to do.
Yeah, you also have that thing like at Rorke's Drift. How do you turn a disaster into a victory? Hand out a few Victoria Crosses. By this part of the war, we needed heroes less than we did earlier in the war. So I would be interested to see the bell curve of how we were giving them out.
Yeah, that's right. Absolutely. That's also part of the picture. Yeah.
Was it controversial at the time? I'm not sure if you're put forward for a Victoria Cross, is it all done in secret? Are people aware? Was it controversial?
It was controversial at the time. So when, David Sterling heard about the turning down of Paddy Maine's Victoria Cross, David Sterling had obviously been released from Colditz. Sterling basically said, they were never going to give it to a figure like Paddy Mayne, but more importantly, they were never going to give it to the Special Air Service. No British member of the SAS has ever won a Victoria Cross. And then when Paddy went to the King to get his third bar DSO, his fourth DSO, the King himself basically said, words to the effect, "I cannot understand why the Victoria Cross has so strangely eluded you." And then other senior figures, Brigadier Laycock, head of special operations, basically wrote to Mayne and said, those in high command do not know their job, because if they did, you would have received the VC. So yes, it was highly controversial at the time.
Is there any precedent for handing them out retrospectively? I mean, obviously, the people get them posthumously, but this is a long time after the events.
Yeah. So last December, the Australian government gave a Victoria Cross posthumously to an individual who was a soldier in Vietnam. Very similar case to Paddy Mayne, ran forward into an ambush to rescue a wounded comrade, brought him back alive. And that was posthumous. The man had long deceased. And of course, it was signed off by the King. And that was a posthumous Victoria Cross. So there is precedent. But, we're not asking for the rules to be changed, the whole procedure to be changed. We're asking for a simple correction of an error at the time.
How do you feel about awarding medals so long after the events, and you're sort of looking through a different lens? But actually, in this instance, I think that question's unfair because, as you said, it was up for it at the time. So it's not as if we've changed the guidelines to give it to him, have we?
That's right. Nothing needs to change. You just need to right or wrong. Simple error. That's all.
Well, it'll be interesting to see what the outcome is. Do you know which way the political wind is blowing?
I've had various conversations with various ministers and ex-ministers. There's very little appetite to overturn the whole system, as you can imagine. Opening floodgates is the phrase they use. But if we can make the argument hit home that we're not asking for that, this is a simple correction of error in this one particular case, I hope we'll get there.
It will be interesting to see how the debate in Parliament goes and what the outcome is from any review. Thank you, Damien. Loyal listener, the full story of Archie Gibson can be found in the fourth of Damien Lewis's SAS Great Escapes book. There are other tales of remarkable daring-do in there for you. I will put a link on the website and in the show notes. Now, don't forget, if you've enjoyed this episode, you can support the show at patreon.com/WW2podcast. By becoming a patron, you'll gain access to ad-free episodes, allowing you to fully immerse yourself in every discussion. Plus, you'll unlock occasional exclusive bonus material, which might not have made it into the podcast. Your support on Patreon helps me keep the podcast running and growing, ensuring I can continue bringing you engaging, high-quality content. So go to patreon.com/WW2 podcast. Sign up. Well, that is it for this episode. Next time we'll be exploring British tanks used by the Red Army. So until then, I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.
Jerry 88mm gun hit our town, blew us the hell out of it.
Stalingrad can never be repaired.
As Allied Commander-in-Chief, I have granted a military armistice.